The day my stepmother told the court, I lost my mind. The room fell dead silent. Celeste thought she had won, bringing witnesses to swear I was unstable. But she made one fatal mistake. She fabricated a digital trail to ruin me, forgetting I make my living tracing data people think is deleted. When the judge removed his glasses, staring at the screen, everyone finally understood the crazy one was the person arrogant enough to edit the truth. My name is Willow Blackwell. I am 36 years old. I sit at the heavy mahogany defense table inside the Halston County Probate and Capacity Court. My hands rest perfectly still on my tailored wool lap. I do not fidget. I do not adjust my posture. Instead, I stare at the high, vaulted ceiling. I count the metal slats on the air conditioning vents. 1, 2, 3, 4. I trace the faint dust outlines clinging to the painted steel with my eyes. I use this strict rhythm to freeze my face. I keep every muscle completely blank. The air in the room is stale. It smells faintly of old floor wax and nervous sweat. The heavy wooden doors remain closed, sealing us inside this grand theater of legal warfare. Across the central aisle sits my stepmother, Celeste Blackwell. She looks like the flawless portrait of a grieving widow. She wears a tasteful cream dress. The thick fabric drapes elegantly, whispering of quiet wealth and deep, dignified sorrow. Around her neck rests a single strand of matte pearls. They do not shine too brightly. Nothing about her appearance is loud or offensive. When she leans over to speak to her counsel, her voice trembles. It shakes just enough to harvest immense pity from everyone within earshot. Yet, she never loses control. Not a single tear ruins her immaculate makeup. She breathes in shallow, measured gasps, delicately dabbing her dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. She is an absolute masterclass in calculated fragility. I watch her from the corner of my eye, noting the absolute precision of her performance. Her attorney stands. Nolan Pike is a man who built a highly lucrative legal career on the grand illusion of feigned moral obligation. He steps out from behind his table and paces slowly before the judge. He buttons his expensive suit jacket with a deliberate, solemn motion. He clears his throat loudly to command the silent room. Your Honor, we are gathered here today to protect a monumental legacy. Pike begins. His thick baritone voice echoes against the dark wood-paneled walls. But more importantly, we are here out of an absolute, heartbreaking necessity to protect a vulnerable woman from her own fracturing mind. Miss Blackwell is exhibiting severe, undeniable signs of high-functioning paranoia. I do not blink. I do not look at him. I simply listen to the sharp tap of his leather shoes against the hard floorboards. She is entirely consumed by dark obsessions, Pike continues, his tone hardening from sympathetic to deeply concerned. She firmly believes she is being continuously tracked. She claims highly confidential legal documents are being secretly altered by unseen enemies. She harbors a deep, unfounded, and frankly, terrifying delusion that control of her family's lucrative company is being systematically stolen from her in the dark of night. Pike signals to his paralegal with a sharp snap of his fingers. A digital projector clicks on, humming loudly in the quiet space. The large screen mounted behind the witness stand flares to life. It displays a high-resolution photograph of my private apartment. The image is blown up for maximum, jarring impact. It looks like an absolute disaster zone. Loose financial papers and shredded legal contracts scatter across the expensive hardwood floor. Half-empty coffee cups stack dangerously high on the white marble kitchen island. Neon sticky notes cover the living room walls in frantic, chaotic patterns, connected by sprawling strings of red yarn. It looks exactly like the war room of a madwoman. Then comes the next slide. A massive, time-stamped log of outbound emails. "These are emails," Pike says, pointing a heavy, accusatory finger at the glowing screen. Sent at 2 o'clock in the morning. Sent at 3:15 in the morning. Sent at 4:45 in the morning. Sent at 5:30 in the morning. Relentless. Frantic messages dispatched to senior company executives and board members. They contain wild, baseless accusations of corporate espionage. They demand immediate, sweeping security audits of systems that have been secure for decades. Next, he taps his laptop to play an audio file. The court speakers crackle. My own voice fills the breathless courtroom. It is a covert recording taken in the hallway right after my father's funeral. My words are incredibly rushed. My tone is harsh, clipped, and completely breathless. I am snapping furiously at an invisible listener about broken firewalls and manipulated server timestamps. Out of context, I sound entirely unhinged. I sound exactly like a woman collapsing violently under the crushing weight of her own mind. Pike arranged every single piece of evidence with absolute surgical precision. Taken together, it builds a flawless, impenetrable narrative of total mental ruin. Pike turns his back to the screen and faces the judge directly. He lowers his voice to a grave, hushed register. Celeste Blackwell brings this difficult petition with a heavy, broken heart. She loves her stepdaughter, but she has absolutely no choice left. Willow Blackwell no longer possesses the mental capacity or the emotional stability to wield her majority voting rights in the Blackwell Family Trust. She is an active, unpredictable danger to the entire enterprise. If this court does not intervene immediately, the company will shatter into pieces. Hundreds of loyal employees will see their jobs vanish overnight. Decades of Grant Blackwell's tireless hard work will be utterly destroyed by the irrational, erratic, and deeply paranoid decisions of a very sick mind. I allow my gaze to drop slowly from the ceiling vents. I look past the shouting lawyers and focus on the crowded gallery sitting behind the thick wooden railing. The audience section is packed shoulder to shoulder. I see the senior board members of Blackwell Archive Logistics. They wear dark, conservative suits and tight, uncomfortable expressions. They shift nervously in their wooden pews. I see a dozen of my father's extended relatives. They lean forward, whispering feverishly behind their manicured hands, darting quick, judgmental glances in my direction. Then I see Reed Harrow. He is Celeste's biological son. He sits in the second row, right next to the center aisle. He watches me intently, his jaw locked tight. His pale eyes do not hold an ounce of genuine sympathy. They hold eager, greedy anticipation. He leans forward, his hands gripping the wooden bench ahead of him. Every single person in those rows looks at me like they are standing at a safe distance waiting for a lethal bomb to finally detonate. They have been carefully, methodically spoon-fed a brilliant story of my total insanity over the past few weeks. Now, they just want me to confirm it for them. They desperately expect a highly public breakdown. They want me to scream, to throw a heavy binder across the room, to prove the unstable monster they were told about is incredibly real. I give them absolutely nothing. I do not react. I do not open my mouth to argue. I do not shake my head in frantic disbelief. I keep my lips pressed tightly together in a firm, flat line. My breathing remains incredibly slow and meticulously measured. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. In any normal, rational situation, total silence feels exactly like an admission of guilt. My utter lack of reaction makes the entire room believe Celeste's carefully crafted story even more. Basic human nature dictates that an innocent person will immediately rise up. An innocent person will shout loudly over the lying lawyer. An innocent person will fight back wildly against a vicious, life-destroying lie. Because I sit perfectly still, resembling a cold stone statue, they think I am heavily medicated, or they think I am entirely too far gone into my own severe delusions to even understand the immense gravity of the legal accusations being hurled directly at me. They are completely, fatally wrong. From the very first minute I walked into this courtroom, I made a strict, unyielding choice. I did not sit at this mahogany defense table to protect myself with frantic, messy emotions. Emotion is exactly what Nolan Pike and Celeste Blackwell desperately want to extract from me. Tears would instantly validate their tragic narrative. Anger would permanently seal my ultimate fate and hand them the company on a silver platter. Instead, I am waiting. I am waiting for the exact, perfect, unavoidable moment. I need them to lay out every single lie with absolute arrogance and total confidence. I need them to build their fraudulent, glittering house of cards right here on the official, unerasable court record. I am forcing every single person on the opposing side to step blindly into a massive trap of their own making. I am letting them lock themselves tightly into sworn, legally binding testimonies they can never, ever retract. I sit in the absolute cold silence, listening to the rhythmic tap of the judge's pen, knowing deeply that a perfect revenge requires absolute, terrifying patience. I am a senior digital preservation and forensic analyst at a private intelligence firm named Meridian Chain Forensics. We are the exact people you call when a massive corporation realizes they have a deeply malicious ghost in their machine. We handle the brutal, high-stakes corporate disputes where millions of dollars vanish into thin air and entire server histories are suddenly wiped clean. Just last year, I spent 72 straight hours locked inside a freezing, windowless server room, unearthing a deleted subfolder that proved a chief financial officer was actively embezzling exactly $4.5 million. I do not deal in feelings, intuition, or gut instincts. I deal in hard, unyielding metadata. I examine hexadecimal codes, server access logs, and the microscopic, invisible footprints left behind when someone arrogant tries to rewrite digital history. I am not a soft woman. I do not possess a warm, accommodating personality. I never learned how to play the role of the sweet, smiling daughter, passing the mashed potatoes at forced holiday dinners. My singular, undeniable talent is spotting the microscopic fractures in digital systems that highly paid information technology architects swear are completely impenetrable. Give me an airtight ledger, and I will find the one missing keystroke that proves someone is lying to your face. I find the dark space between the lies. I inherited this relentless, clinical pragmatism directly from my father. Grant Blackwell was not a man of gentle comforts or warm paternal embraces. He was the founder and chief executive officer of Blackwell Archive Logistics. He possessed a brutal, brilliant, and entirely unsentimental vision for business. While other real estate developers fought tooth and nail over shiny downtown high-rises and luxury apartment complexes, my father bought up dead, sprawling commercial zones. He took massive, abandoned shopping malls and bankrupt retail parks, gutting them down to their bare concrete bones. He transformed hundreds of thousands of square feet of dead space into impenetrable, high-security storage centers. His clients were elite legal firms, multinational insurance conglomerates, and private healthcare networks. Inside those reinforced concrete walls, behind biometric locks and armed guards, sat the most valuable, highly sensitive physical and digital records in the entire country. He built an absolute empire on the single guarantee of total permanence and ironclad security. He promised his clients that their darkest secrets were perfectly safe with him. My biological mother passed away when I was barely out of middle school. It was a quiet, devastating loss that hollowed our massive house out completely. Exactly 2 years and 4 months later, Celeste floated into our lives. She arrived like the absolute picture of a perfect, healing presence. She knew exactly how to behave in polite society. She knew exactly what reassuring, gentle words to murmur to grieving relatives. She possessed this uncanny, almost frightening ability to walk into a cold, silent house and suddenly make the rooms feel artificially warmer. She bought expensive, tasteful throw pillows. She arranged fresh, fragrant flowers on every mahogany table. She organized elegant charity galas and smiled perfectly for the society pages. But I never bought the act, not for a single second. From the very beginning, I looked at Celeste and saw something dangerously slick. She was entirely too smooth. Every smile, every gentle touch on my father's arm, every perfectly timed sigh of exhaustion felt meticulously calculated. It was as if she never actually experienced genuine human emotion, but merely studied it from afar so she could efficiently manipulate the feelings of everyone around her. She was a master-class social engineer operating inside a marriage. She knew how to mirror people, how to make them feel heard, all while slowly tightening a velvet noose around their better judgment. Because I absolutely refused to stomach that suffocating, synthetic harmony, I moved out the very morning I turned 18. I packed 2 suitcases and left the sprawling family estate behind. I built my own completely separate life from the ground up. I fought relentlessly to establish my own fiercely independent career in digital forensics. I kept a very deliberate, highly calculated distance from the country club dinners and the forced family vacations. I did not want her perfect, manicured hands anywhere near my reality. But despite the physical distance, I maintained a profound, ironclad connection with my father. It was just a highly unconventional one. Grant Blackwell was utterly incapable of offering typical paternal affection. He did not hug. He never once said the words, "I love you," out loud. But he showed his absolute trust in me in the most practical, undeniable way possible. He treated me as his absolute equal in the realm of paranoia and cold logic. Whenever he encountered a truly vicious corporate problem, he bypassed his entire fleet of expensive corporate attorneys and called me directly. If he needed someone to dissect an incredibly complex, predatory merger contract, my encrypted phone rang at midnight. If a competitor submitted a highly suspicious buyout proposal that smelled of hidden liabilities and toxic debt, he sent the files to my personal, air-gapped server. If a regional manager's database showed even the slightest whisper of unauthorized access or altered inventory logs, Grant brought me in through the back door. "Look under the floorboards. Willow," he would tell me over a secure line late at night, his voice gruff and tired. "Tell me exactly what the rats are chewing on." I was his ultimate fail-safe. I was the only person in his massive, wealthy orbit he knew with absolute certainty could never be bought, charmed, or intimidated. He knew I saw the world exactly the way he did. He saw a series of complex systems always waiting to be inevitably breached, exactly 7 months before his sudden, fatal collapse. My father made a highly covert, devastatingly effective legal maneuver. We sat alone in the heavily soundproofed downtown office of his oldest estate attorney. My father systematically dismantled the existing voting structure of the Blackwell Family Trust. Page by page, clause by clause, he legally restructured the core ownership. He quietly transferred a massive block of controlling shares directly into my name, ensuring I held exactly 51% of the absolute voting power. He did not do this to make me incredibly wealthy. He did it to build an impenetrable firewall around his legacy. He knew the absolute vultures circling his life's work, and he knew Celeste's true nature far better than he ever let on. He wanted to guarantee that if he ever died suddenly, I would hold enough absolute voting power to block any hostile takeover, any shady merger, or any greedy, short-sighted fire sale. It was his final, brilliant defensive play to ensure the company outlived him. For months, that critical amendment remained a perfectly kept secret. Only 3 people on this earth knew the new, dangerous reality: my father, the estate attorney, and me. We locked the heavy parchment documents away in a fireproof vault. We said absolutely nothing to the board of directors. We said absolutely nothing to Celeste. But secrets in the high-stakes world of corporate wealth never stay buried forever. Eventually, through relentless snooping, a misplaced legal invoice, or perhaps just a terrifyingly accurate intuition, Celeste discovered the crushing truth. She realized that despite her long years of flawless acting, despite her endless patience playing the devoted, supportive corporate wife, she would never actually hold the keys to the kingdom. She realized that when the king finally fell, the absolute power would not pass to the smiling, grieving widow. It would pass directly to the cold, analytical daughter she had spent years trying to push out of the family frame. That was the exact moment the silent war truly began. That was the moment Celeste decided that if she could not legally inherit the Blackwell empire, she would simply have to prove the rightful heir was entirely insane. The collapse happened with terrifying precision. My father suffered a massive brain aneurysm exactly 3 weeks before the most critical board of directors meeting of the decade. This was not a routine quarterly review. The sole item on the upcoming agenda was a highly controversial, irreversible vote on whether to sell our flagship physical data vault to a notoriously aggressive private equity firm known as Rook Haven Capital. The timing of his ruptured blood vessel was so perfectly disastrous, it felt like a calculated corporate strike. The hospital environment immediately transformed into a hostile, tightly controlled territory. Inside the sterile walls of the intensive care unit, Celeste executed a flawless, aggressive takeover of his final days. She did not just sit by his bedside weeping. She managed the entire floor like a ruthless warden. She physically confiscated his secure smartphone within the first 20 minutes of his admission. She positioned herself as the absolute gatekeeper between his failing body and the outside world. She dictated the visitor logs with an iron fist. She decided which senior vice presidents were permitted a brief, awkward gaze through the glass door, and which long-standing partners were firmly blocked down at the lobby security desk. When the attending neurologists delivered their grim updates, Celeste was always the first to intercept them. She absorbed the brutal medical facts and then carefully filtered the reality, broadcasting only her curated, tragic version of events to the company. She built an impenetrable wall of soft whispers and tearful sighs around a dying king. He passed away entirely too fast. The specialist had predicted a slow, agonizing decline lasting perhaps 2 months. But his heart simply stopped fighting. His sudden death left behind a suffocating, heavy atmosphere that hung over the massive funeral. But the mourning was instantly overshadowed by the terrifying power vacuum he left in his wake. The earth had barely settled over his casket before every single calculating eye inside the company pivoted sharply toward the Blackwell Family Trust. The empire lacked a ruler, and the throne was suddenly empty just days before a multi-million-dollar buyout vote. The tension crested the very next morning inside the heavily soundproofed downtown office of the estate attorney. The air conditioning hummed coldly as the lawyer unsealed the final, unalterable directives. He read the terms in a flat, clinical voice. The financial distribution was exceedingly generous. Celeste was officially granted a lifetime right of residency in the sprawling family mansion. She was awarded a staggering post-marital monthly allowance that guaranteed a life of absolute unbroken luxury. Furthermore, she received full administrative control over a separate, massively funded private trust dedicated exclusively to her high society charitable foundations. She got the pristine public image, the sprawling real estate, and the endless stream of liquid cash. But then the lawyer turned the page to the corporate succession clauses. He cleared his throat and formally announced that the absolute, decisive voting power over the company, the undeniable authority to block or approve any major corporate sale, rested entirely and exclusively in my hands. I watched Celeste carefully. I waited for the mask to crack. I waited for a flash of genuine rage, a sharp intake of breath, or a tightened fist. She gave me absolutely nothing of the sort. She simply went perfectly, chillingly still for exactly 4 seconds. Then, she lowered her head and offered a soft, tremendously sad smile. It was a terrifyingly brilliant performance. It was just enough to make every single board member and relative in that room believe she possessed a profound, graceful nobility. By sitting there completely silent and looking slightly wounded, she instantly painted herself as the high-minded victim, leaving me to look like the cold, calculating, emotionally dead daughter sitting rigidly on the opposite side of the mahogany table. The mourning period did not even last a full business week. Exactly 4 days after the funeral, a highly unusual delivery arrived at the corporate headquarters. The board of directors received a thick, sealed bundle marked as an urgent executive document package. The attached cover letter boldly claimed that in the final days before his sudden aneurysm, my father had experienced a radical change of heart. The paper stated he suddenly wanted to aggressively push the Brookhaven capital buyout through as quickly as possible. The justification written in the text claimed a rapid sale was the only way to preserve the ultimate honor of the company and protect the jobs of hundreds of loyal employees. I secured a scanned copy of the package within an hour. I locked myself inside my home office, booted up my isolated forensic monitors, and read the first 3 pages. The alarm bells in my head were absolutely deafening. I did not need advanced decryption software to see the glaring rot in the paperwork. The forensic discrepancies screamed at me from the screen. First, there was the rhythm of the signature. When my father signed his name, the loop on the letter G was always a sharp, aggressive slash. The signature on this supposed final directive featured a perfectly, artificially rounded loop, the kind produced by someone slowly tracing a projection. Second, the document utilized margin spacing formatted for a standardized modern legal template. My father famously despised modern templates and strictly forced his assistants to use a custom, outdated margin layout from 2 decades ago. Then came the financial formatting. Whenever my father wrote out massive sums of money in his personal memorandums, he never, ever used commas to separate the thousands. He always typed unbroken, solid strings of numbers. These new pages featured perfectly placed, grammatically correct commas. Finally, the ultimate tell was the vocabulary. The document repeatedly referred to our secondary cold storage vault as Sector 4, while that was its official designation on public blueprints. My father had personally poured the concrete for that facility. In every single internal communication, he only ever called it the iron box. The package was a brilliantly constructed forgery, but it was manufactured by someone who only understood the polished corporate exterior of Grant Blackwell, entirely missing the stubborn, idiosyncratic habits of the actual man. I printed the flawed pages, marched directly into the executive suites, and cornered Celeste in the carpeted hallway outside the main boardroom. I did not raise my voice. I systematically laid out the technical discrepancies in sharp, rapid-fire succession. I demanded an explanation for the artificial signature and the glaring formatting errors. I expected her to stumble. I expected her to launch into a frantic, defensive argument. Instead, she stopped walking. She turned to face me, placing a warm, perfectly manicured hand gently on my rigid shoulder. She looked deep into my eyes with an expression of immense, suffocating pity. "Oh, Willow," she whispered softly. She made absolutely sure her voice carried just enough for the two passing vice presidents to hear her clear, maternal tone. "You are simply drowning in so much grief right now. Your poor mind is completely exhausted. You are looking for dangerous enemies in the empty shadows, seeing wild conspiracies in standard legal paperwork just because you cannot accept the reality that your father is truly gone." She did not refute a single piece of evidence. She did not argue about the margins or the commas. That single perfectly delivered sentence was the devastating pivot. That was the exact moment she executed her most brilliant strategic maneuver. She weaponized my lifelong, sharp intuition and seamlessly spun it into a tragic symptom of severe mental illness. If I pointed out a blatant lie, I was simply being overly paranoid. If I discovered a forged document, I was aggressively delusional. She transformed my greatest professional strength into a crippling psychological liability in the eyes of everyone watching. I realized instantly that a terrifying trap had already been set in motion. By the end of that exact same week, the central corporate security systems began logging highly erratic, inexplicable behavior. The network administrators noted that my secure, encrypted user account began frantically accessing highly restricted directories at all hours of the night. My digital footprint showed me opening deeply buried employee performance reviews, old architectural blueprints, and irrelevant human resources folders at 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning. These were files I had absolutely no logical reason to open. They were directories I had never once clicked on during my entire tenure at the company. Someone had stolen my credentials or spoofed my internal network address. They were actively, methodically building a pristine, undeniable digital trail. They were creating a massive backlog of server logs designed specifically to prove to the board of directors, and eventually to a presiding judge, that my mind was rapidly deteriorating. They were manufacturing the exact data needed to prove I was entirely out of control, laying the groundwork to legally pry my hands off the steering wheel before the buyout vote could ever take place. The true terror of a targeted psychological demolition is how utterly quiet the initial explosive charges are when they are planted. Celeste did not launch a direct, screaming assault against my character. She understood that a blunt attack would only make her look vindictive. Instead, she methodically constructed a highly sophisticated, multi-layered stage designed to make my complete mental collapse look like an undeniable, organic tragedy. To achieve this, she needed the absolute perfect proxies. She retained Nolan Pike, a litigation attorney who possessed a terrifying gift for making the most vicious corporate assassinations sound like heavy, unavoidable moral duties. Behind closed doors, Pike was the architect of the narrative, but to give that narrative medical authority, Celeste brought in Dr. Simon Rafe. Dr. Rafe was a highly expensive, private psychiatrist who operated out of a pristine glass office across the city. He charged $800 an hour for his signature on high-stakes competency evaluations. The most terrifying fact about his involvement was that I had never once met him. I had never sat on his leather couch. I had never spoken a single word to the man. Yet, within 48 hours of being retained by Celeste, Dr. Rafe produced a staggering 30-page document officially titled A Declaration of Severe Professional Concern. He diagnosed me from afar, using highly curated fragments of my life provided exclusively by my stepmother. He weaponized psychiatric terminology, labeling my intense grief as clinical detachment and my forensic career habits as dangerous. Escalating paranoia. With a medical framework established, the whispering campaign began. This specific task was assigned to Reed Harrow. My stepbrother did not shout these accusations in the corporate lobby. He utilized the lethal efficiency of quiet, troubled confessions. Reed cornered senior board members at private country club lunches and caught my father's aging cousins in the quiet corners of charity dinners. He perfected a look of deeply pained, brotherly exhaustion. "She has not slept a full night in over 3 weeks," Reed would whisper, staring down into his Scotch glass as if the burden was tearing him apart. "She keeps locking herself in the dark, insisting unseen people are altering her server logins. She even thinks someone is stealing her private medical records. I am genuinely terrified for her safety. She is completely losing her grip on reality." Reed planted these toxic seeds with absolute precision. He did not ask anyone to take action. He simply infected their perception of me. By the time I walked into the corporate headquarters to review the quarterly financial ledgers, I could feel the invisible weight of their altered stares. They were no longer looking at a senior forensic analyst. They were closely observing a ticking time bomb, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Then came the physical evidence, meticulously leaked to the executive committee. A series of high-resolution photographs of my private apartment began circulating through the secure corporate email servers. I recognized the angles immediately. Someone had accessed my home under the false pretense of a routine building maintenance inspection. The images were a masterclass in visual manipulation. They showed my living room floor completely covered in scattered, highly sensitive corporate documents. They showed a massive whiteboard dominating my dining area, covered in frantic red marker timelines and overlapping sticky notes. The kitchen counter featured a cluster of amber prescription bottles standing next to 4 empty, unwashed coffee mugs. To an outsider, the photographs looked exactly like the undeniable lair of a woman experiencing a high-functioning psychotic break. But the context was violently stripped away. The documents on the floor were part of a massive, legitimate data auditing project I was running for a client based in London. The whiteboard timeline was standard forensic link analysis, a basic visual tool used in every major cybersecurity firm on the planet to track unauthorized server breaches. The medication on the counter consisted entirely of over-the-counter melatonin and standard vitamins, vital for surviving graveyard shifts analyzing international data packets. But presented without truth, the visual narrative was deeply damning. The most profound, breath-stealing violation involved the audio files. Following my father's sudden death, I had briefly attended private grief counseling sessions. It was the one place I allowed my iron exterior to crack. I paid a licensed therapist precisely $250 a session to sit in a soundproof room and process the suffocating reality of my loss. Someone bypassed the clinic's digital security, accessed the encrypted cloud backup, and stole the audio logs. They did not release the full recordings. They put the audio through highly advanced editing software. They spliced a sentence where I described the crushing, suffocating feeling of losing my father directly next to a separate sentence where I aggressively complained about missing system data packets. The resulting audio made it sound as though I believed corporate ghosts were physically haunting my servers. They compressed the spacing between my words, making my speech pattern sound frantically accelerated, panicked, and entirely detached from the physical world. Armed with this manufactured arsenal, Celeste officially filed an emergency petition with the county court to temporarily suspend my executive voting rights. The legal justification was steeped in supposed corporate altruism. The petition argued that if the company continued to be obstructed by an uncontrolled mental patient, the impending, massive asset sale to Rookhaven Capital would completely collapse. Celeste claimed that my unchecked insanity would single-handedly destroy the financial security of over 500 loyal employees. She painted a picture of absolute financial apocalypse, placing the entire blame squarely on my allegedly fractured mind. The isolation that followed was swift and freezing. I reached out to my most trusted professional mentors, the people who had praised my razor-sharp logic for years. I called senior forensic analysts and veteran corporate attorneys who knew exactly how brilliant my mind was. One by one, they politely declined to return my calls. The few who did pick up the phone spoke in hushed, careful tones. The legal dossier Celeste had assembled looked simply too overwhelming on paper. In the high-stakes corporate world, no one wants to stand anywhere near the blast radius of a messy psychological dispute. Furthermore, absolutely no one wanted to be publicly positioned against a grieving widow who was supposedly fighting to save her dead husband's grand legacy from a destructive daughter. Sitting alone in my dark office, staring at the flashing green lights of my secure server tower, the true shape of the conspiracy finally crystallized in my mind. For a brief period, I had believed Celeste was doing this out of pure, deep-seated hatred. I thought she was punishing me for refusing to submit to her synthetic family dynamic. But as I reviewed the timeline of the buyout proposal, the real motive became blindingly clear. This was not an emotional vendetta. This was an extreme, high-speed financial race. The voting deadline for the Rookhaven Capital merger was exactly 14 days away. If I retained my voting power, I would instantly veto the sale, blocking a transaction worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Celeste was actively running against a strict financial clock. The entire narrative of my tragic mental breakdown was nothing more than a highly effective skeleton key designed to violently force open a vault of unimaginable wealth. She did not actually care if I was crazy or sane. She only needed me legally neutralized for exactly 14 days. The most terrifying aspect of her entire scheme was not the sheer audacity of the lie itself. It was the deeply unsettling realization that her flawless weapon was forged almost entirely from the truth. My crippling insomnia was completely real. My sharp, aggressive irritability was real. My heavy, suffocating grief was real. I was indeed staying awake until 3 in the morning. I was indeed obsessively tracking data logs. I was indeed furiously angry at the people around me. Celeste had simply gathered all the raw, undeniable facts of my current existence, stripped away the logical causes, and swapped the conclusions. She used the heavy, authentic pieces of my broken heart to build the exact cage she intended to lock me inside forever. I did not take to social media to scream my absolute innocence. I did not drive frantically to the homes of my extended relatives to weep on their floral sofas and beg them to believe me. Hysteria is the exact currency Celeste was banking on. She wanted a messy, public meltdown to cement her carefully crafted narrative. I operate in an entirely different currency. I lock the heavy deadbolt on my apartment door, pull the thick blackout curtains completely shut, and powered on my customized forensic server rig. It was time to hunt. Blackwell Archive Logistics operated on ironclad service-level agreements. Buried deep within our massive vendor contracts were specialized disaster recovery clauses, designed specifically for catastrophic earthquakes or devastating international ransomware strikes. Rather than trying to fight the board of directors openly, I used my still active administrative backdoor to trigger a silent, emergency server mirror. I copied the entire corporate digital ecosystem into a highly quarantined sandbox. But grabbing the data was only half the battle. I needed a legally undeniable chain of custody. I picked up my burner phone and dialed Lena Dorsey. Lena was my former senior instructor at Meridian Chain Forensics. She was entirely ruthless, deeply paranoid, and possessed a mind like a steel trap. I need a complete architectural freeze. Lena, I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat while staring at the lines of code cascading down my left monitor. They're going to start overwriting the central server logs by tomorrow morning. I need you to establish a secure third-party perimeter around the raw data right now. Send me the encrypted routing keys. Lena replied instantly, her tone devoid of any surprise or hesitation. I will lock down the shadow servers so tight, God himself could not delete a single comma. With the pristine data successfully frozen, I began dissecting the erratic, late-night emails I had supposedly sent to the executive board. To the naked eye, they looked exactly like the desperate, disjointed ramblings of an exhausted woman losing her grip on reality. But digital text possesses a distinct, measurable genetic makeup. I isolated a microscopic anomaly in the punctuation. The fabricated emails heavily featured an elongated M-dash. This specific typographic character was automatically generated by a default keyboard setting exclusive to high-end Macintosh operating systems. I build my own machines from scratch and run exclusively on strict Linux distributions. I literally do not have the basic capability to accidentally type that specific character without running a highly complex, deliberate manual macro. Celeste, however, drafted all her elegant charity invitations and foundation newsletters on a rose gold laptop that utilized that exact operating system every single day. I pivoted my focus away from the corporate network and aimed it directly at the physical architecture of my childhood home. The sprawling family mansion was wired with a sophisticated, invisible web of smart sensors. I pulled the raw data packets directly from the environmental control unit. The logs painted a vivid, undeniable picture. According to the sworn legal affidavit submitted to the judge, Celeste claimed she was heavily sedated on prescription sleeping pills for the entire week following my father's death. She swore she never once left her master bedroom. Yet, the motion sensors and magnetic door contacts installed on my father's private home office told a wildly different story. At 2:15 in the morning, at 3:40 in the morning, and again at 4:10 in the morning. The heavy oak door was opened. The room temperature spiked by precisely 2 degrees, indicating sustained human body heat. Someone was in there, standing in the dark, systematically sifting through his physical files while the grieving widow was supposedly dead to the world. But digital breadcrumbs were not quite enough to secure a victory in a court of law. I needed physical tethers. I turned my undivided attention to the so-called original documents Celeste had submitted to her legal team. My father's forged signature was glaring, but I was looking for something much smaller. I scanned the high-resolution legal copies into my system and applied a specialized blue light spectrum filter. There they were, microscopic, nearly invisible yellow tracking dots scattered across the white margins. Printer steganography. Every modern commercial color printer secretly embeds a microscopic matrix of dots onto every single page it produces, encoding the exact serial number of the machine and the precise hour and minute the document was printed. I ran the dot matrix through a proprietary decryption tool. The serial number did not belong to any authorized machine on the corporate headquarters registry. I ran a relentless cross-reference against executive expense reports. The machine was a high-capacity laser printer purchased exactly 14 months ago by Brent Sloan. Brent was our chief financial officer. The shipping address on the invoice was not his downtown luxury penthouse. It was a secluded lakehouse property he owned 3 hours north of the city limits. The direct inclusion of the chief financial officer was the key turning the lock in the dark. I immediately pulled the corporate travel logs, private flight manifests, and heavily redacted corporate credit card statements. I overlaid Brent's travel history with Celeste's highly publicized charity schedule. The overlap was staggering. 8 months prior to my father's death, Celeste attended a women's empowerment gala in a neighboring state. Brent supposedly attended an investor survey summit entirely on the other side of the country, but their encrypted phone pings registered on the exact same remote cell tower grid near a luxury mountain resort for 4 consecutive days. They had been operating a highly coordinated, deeply intimate partnership for well over a year, masked purely by administrative red tape and corporate funds. The final, undeniable piece of leverage fell into my lap when I analyzed the timestamp of the most damning email in Celeste's arsenal. The message was explicitly designed to make me look like I was actively, maliciously sabotaging the upcoming corporate sale. The metadata indicated the email was drafted and sent from my primary account at exactly 9:45 in the morning on the second Tuesday of last month. The forger was incredibly arrogant. They assumed digital network spoofing was entirely sufficient. They completely forgot that the physical world is saturated with unblinking eyes. At 9:45 in the morning on that specific Tuesday, I was standing in the middle of a massive international airport security line, 2 states away. I pulled the heavily encrypted surveillance footage from the Federal Transportation Database. The high-definition video clearly showed me placing my phone and my laptop into a gray plastic bin, sliding them through the X-ray machine, while my hands were completely empty. I was physically separated from every electronic device I owned at the exact second that devastating email was supposedly typed and sent. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the harsh blue light of the monitors reflecting off my retinas. I was not just fighting a bitter, theatrical stepmother anymore. I was staring at the exposed wiring of a massive, highly coordinated corporate execution. They were dismantling my entire reputation, brick by brick, utilizing a devastating combination of financial leverage and manipulated mob psychology. They knew exactly how to make an isolated woman look absolutely hysterical. And they knew exactly how to hide a multi-million-dollar theft behind the heavy smoke of family tragedy. But they made one fundamental, fatal error. They assumed I would break under the heavy psychological pressure and surrender. They did not realize I had spent my entire life learning exactly how to track predators in the dark. I bypassed the internal executive portal entirely. If they were monitoring my network traffic, I wanted them to see dead air. Instead, I routed my connection through a secure virtual private network based out of Zurich and began scraping the state and federal public registry databases. I pulled the raw, unredacted corporate filings. I cross-referenced the public shell declarations with the highly sanitized transaction summary Celeste's legal team had casually provided to the board of directors. There were massive, gaping holes in their version of the narrative. They had deliberately omitted a series of highly confidential transaction appendices. I ran a brute force decryption script on the secure portal used by Brookhaven Capital's external auditors. It took exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes for the firewall to crack. When the hidden appendices finally downloaded onto my local drive, the entire architecture of the lie illuminated my dark office. The board of directors truly believed they were voting on a standard asset liquidation to save a struggling logistics company from bankruptcy. They were being completely played in broad daylight. This was not a rescue mission. It was a perfectly engineered, malicious corporate vampire act. The buyout was specifically designed to aggressively drain the future market value of Blackwell Archive Logistics right before an inevitable industry explosion. My father had spent the last 5 years quietly acquiring specialized, climate-controlled real estate because he knew the federal regulations regarding medical evidence storage were scheduled to become aggressively stricter in exactly 2 years. He positioned the company to absolutely dominate that incoming market shift. Brookhaven Capital knew about the incoming boom. They wanted to buy our infrastructure at a heavily depreciated basement price, hold it for 24 months, and then flip it for a staggering 500% profit. But the private equity firm was not acting alone. They needed inside operators to force the door open. And those operators demanded their cut of the incoming slaughter. I opened Schedule C of the hidden appendix. Buried on page 47 was a provision for a post-merger payout labeled as a transitional consulting fee. Upon the successful closure of the sale, a firm named Marigold Advisory was guaranteed an immediate, liquid cash transfer of exactly $8,500,000. According to the polished corporate prospectus, Marigold Advisory was an independent, third-party transition management group. They supposedly had absolutely zero existing ties to Blackwell Archive Logistics, Brookhaven Capital, or any current executive officer. I do not believe in coincidences. I believe in paper trails. I initiated a deep dive trace on Marigold Advisory. I pulled their limited liability company registration from the Delaware State Tax Archives. I peeled back 3 distinct layers of corporate shielding, tracking the registered agent signatures and the routing numbers for their primary commercial bank accounts. The registered operating officer of Marigold Advisory was a man named Arthur Sterling. Arthur Sterling was Celeste's biological older brother. The secondary signatory on the corporate tax returns was an independent certified public accountant who, according to state licensing records, served as the exclusive personal wealth manager for Brent Sloan. The $8,500,000 was not a consulting fee. It was a massive, untraceable kickback. Brent had been setting the stage for this lucrative payout for over 18 months. As the chief financial officer, he had absolute unilateral authority over the operational budget. I pulled the historical maintenance ledgers and compared them against the physical inspection reports from our regional facility managers. Brent had systematically, intentionally delayed hundreds of critically necessary infrastructure upgrades. He canceled the installation of advanced server cooling arrays. He denied the budget requests for reinforced biometric security gates. He starved the physical lifeblood of the company by aggressively cutting those massive operational expenses. Brent artificially inflated our earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. He made the quarterly profit margins look incredibly healthy and highly attractive to external buyers in the extreme short term. But it was a complete illusion. He was building a catastrophic technical debt time bomb. He was creating a scenario where the physical facilities would inevitably face massive, expensive failures within a year, leaving the new buyers to foot a massive repair bill while he walked away with a heavily inflated, short-term executive performance bonus directly tied to the final sale price of the company. But all of this intricate financial engineering required one crucial element to succeed. It required my total absence. If I walked into that boardroom and exercised my 51% majority voting power, the Brookhaven Capital deal would instantly die on the table. Brent would lose his executive bonus. Celeste and her brother would lose their $8 million kickback. That was the genius of the temporary guardianship petition Celeste had filed in probate court. She did not actually need to convince a medical board that I was permanently, incurably insane. She did not need to lock me inside a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life. She only needed to plant a sufficient seed of reasonable doubt in the mind of a single, highly cautious county judge. If the judge felt even a slight hesitation about my mental stability, he would grant a temporary injunction. He would suspend my voting rights and appoint a neutral, court-approved financial conservator to manage the trust for a period of 90 days. That neutral conservator would look at Brent's artificially inflated financial projections, listen to Nolan Pike's smooth legal arguments, and immediately rubber stamp the corporate sale within 72 hours. They just needed me paralyzed long enough to sign the closing documents. As I dug deeper into the financial archives, hunting for any other hidden leverage they might hold, I stumbled across a heavily encrypted subfolder in my father's personal executive drive. It contained the finalized policy documents for a massive, private executive life insurance contract. The death benefit was staggering. It guaranteed a lump sum payout of $25 million directly to his surviving spouse. But my father was a deeply paranoid man, and he wrote his contracts with razor blades. There was a highly specific, non-standard rider attached to the expedited payout clause. The $25 million would only be released by the underwriters within the first 30 days of his death if, and only if, there were absolutely no pending legal disputes regarding estate fraud, corporate mismanagement, or fiduciary negligence. If I officially challenged the Brookhaven Capital sale on the grounds of corporate fraud, I would instantly trigger a massive federal investigation. That investigation would automatically freeze the $25 million life insurance payout indefinitely. Celeste was staring down the barrel of two rapidly approaching, massive financial deadlines. She needed the $8 million kickback from the corporate sale, and she desperately needed the $25 million life insurance check to clear. Before I could expose the rot in the floorboards, she had a strict 30-day window to completely neutralize my authority and utterly destroy my professional credibility. I sat back in the heavy darkness of my home office, listening to the quiet hum of my cooling fans. The grand illusion finally shattered completely. The heartbreaking narrative playing out in the public eye was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. The entire city thought they were watching a tragic, deeply personal family drama. They thought they were witnessing an exhausted, grieving stepmother desperately trying to save a legendary family legacy from an unhinged, deeply paranoid stepdaughter. It was all a spectacular, theatrical smokescreen. The reality was utterly devoid of human emotion. This was not a story about grief, love, or the complicated bonds of a blended family. It was a ruthless, highly calculated corporate hostile takeover. Celeste and Brent had weaponized the delicate language of psychological therapy and the sacred optics of family morality to execute a $33 million heist right out in the open. Money was the true, ugly skeleton holding this entire nightmare together. I drove out to the industrial fringes of Ash Creek just past midnight. The facility was a desolate, sprawling expanse of corrugated metal units bordered by cracked asphalt. The exact kind of place people utilized to bury the heavy physical remnants of their past. My father kept a secondary storage locker out here in the dark. For years. I completely ignored its existence. I assumed it was nothing more than a graveyard for obsolete server racks, rusted hardware tools, and dusty corporate mementos nobody had the heart to throw away after the funeral. It was entirely off the grid, detached from the pristine corporate headquarters. It was the absolute last place anyone from Celeste's highly paid legal team would ever think to look. I pulled the heavy, groaning rolling door upward. The stale air inside smelled sharply of old engine grease and dry dust. I clicked on a heavy-duty flashlight, sweeping the bright, harsh beam across towering stacks of unlabeled cardboard boxes. Tucked securely beneath a thick canvas tarp in the far back corner sat a heavy steel fireproof lockbox. It was an archaic model, relying on a mechanical rotary dial instead of a modern biometric scanner. I knelt on the freezing concrete floor. I rested my fingers on the cold metal dials and spun them. 0, 8, 1, 4. August 14th. It was my childhood birthday. The heavy steel latch disengaged with a solid, deeply satisfying click. Inside the box, there were absolutely no sentimental photo albums or tearful, handwritten goodbye letters. Grant Blackwell did not deal in emotional currency, even in death. Instead, I found a thick, black leather-bound notebook. I flipped open the stiff cover, shining my light onto the pages. The paper was filled entirely with his sharp, aggressive, unmistakable handwriting. It was not a personal diary. It was a meticulous, deeply paranoid surveillance log. He had recorded exact dates, precise times, and specific names of individuals entering our family estate and the corporate headquarters. He noted strange vehicle license plates, the exact duration of specific closed-door meetings, and the precise minutes certain executive network portals were accessed. It read exactly like the cold, clinical observation report of a veteran intelligence officer building a hostile target profile inside his own home, tucked between the stiff pages detailing the second week of October. A small folded piece of yellow legal paper slipped out and fluttered to the concrete floor. I picked it up. There was only one single sentence written across the center in dark blue ink. If the digital looks too clean, trust the recovery log. I stared at the ink for a long time. I felt a sudden, sharp tightness grip my chest. That was exactly how my father spoke. He offered absolutely no soft explanations, no warm comforts, and no elaborate, hand-holding instructions. He just handed you the raw, unpolished tool you needed to survive the incoming fire. He knew with absolute certainty that I would eventually open this box and read this note. That single, cryptic sentence was the undeniable proof that he had smelled the heavy, rotting stench of corporate fraud long before his blood vessels gave out. I dug deeper into the metal box. Beneath the heavy notebook lay a cluster of physical, paper receipts clipped tightly together. The top slip was a printed invoice from a very discreet, independent motel located in a small mountain town. The checkout date was stamped exactly 3 months before his fatal collapse. I recognized the town immediately. It was the exact same isolated municipality where Brent Sloan owned his secluded luxury lake house. I systematically cross-referenced the dates in my head with the highly publicized charity schedules I had analyzed earlier in my apartment. That was the exact same week Celeste had sworn to the board of directors she was entirely alone, leading a silent, technology-free meditation retreat for her philanthropic foundation. My father had not been resting at the estate during that week. He had driven 3 hours north to physically track his own wife. He had stood in the freezing mountain air, confirming the absolute worst betrayal with his own 2 eyes. He knew about the illicit affair. He knew Celeste and Brent were actively maneuvering their pieces around the board behind his back. The most devastating piece of evidence rested at the very bottom of the fireproof safe. It was a printed draft of a formal corporate directive on heavily watermarked executive stationery. The document was an official termination of duties. It clearly mandated the immediate, unpaid suspension of Brent Sloan from his role as Chief Financial Officer, pending a massive, independent forensic audit of the entire corporate financial infrastructure. The signature line at the bottom was blank. My father was actively preparing a massive, lethal counterattack. He was going to tear their entire corrupt financial structure down to the studs and expose them both. But his physical body betrayed him before he could sign the paper. However, the existence of this draft created a massive, glaring contradiction. If my father was merely days away from firing Brent and ordering a full forensic audit, why did the official company records show the independent audit being permanently canceled? I drove back to my apartment as the cold sun began to rise over the city skyline. I locked myself inside my office and pulled up the mirrored server data I had secured through Helena. I hunted down the specific internal email that had abruptly canceled the upcoming independent financial review. I found the message buried deep in the archives. It was sent directly from my father's secure executive account to the external auditing firm. But I did not look at the corporate text. I looked exclusively at the highly encrypted routing metadata. I checked the exact digital timestamp. The cancellation order was transmitted at precisely 8:45 in the evening on the second day of his emergency hospitalization. I pulled out my secure phone and accessed the copied digital files of his intensive care medical charts. At 8:45 in the evening on that specific Tuesday, Grant Blackwell was heavily sedated. The attending neurologist had administered a massive dose of intravenous painkillers and medically induced a deep coma to stabilize his rising cranial pressure. He was completely unconscious, breathing through a plastic machine tube, absolutely incapable of holding a smartphone or typing a coherent, multi-paragraph corporate directive. Someone had logged into his personal email account while he lay dying in a sterile hospital bed. I needed the exact origin point. I isolated the hidden Internet Protocol header attached to the fraudulent cancellation email. I did not just look at the standard routing numbers. I dug straight into the microscopic media access control address. Every single device connected to a wireless network possesses a unique, hard-coded physical identifier. I ran a complex cross-reference matrix, matching that specific alphanumeric identifier against the historical wireless router logs of the family mansion. The digital ping did not come from a secure corporate laptop. It did not come from my father's heavily encrypted mobile device. The unique hardware identifier belonged to a wall-mounted smart home control tablet. It was the exact same sleek, white touchscreen tablet permanently mounted on the wall directly beside the bed inside Celeste's private master bedroom. It was a tiny, seemingly insignificant architectural detail, but it formed the unbreakable steel spine of my entire defense. Celeste had been entirely too comfortable. She felt so completely untouchable while playing the weeping, devastated wife that she casually used her own bedside device to access her dying husband's secure account. She permanently canceled the independent audit that would have instantly exposed her lover's massive financial crimes, leaving a permanent digital fingerprint right next to where she slept. I sat in the quiet, blue glow of my forensic monitors, letting the absolute gravity of the discovery wash entirely over me. For long, agonizing weeks, the suffocating narrative had forced me to believe I was entirely alone in this fight. I thought my father had simply died and left me stranded in a lightless room with a brilliant, highly dangerous predator. I truly thought he had been completely blinded by Celeste's perfect social performance, completely unaware of the sharp knife pressing steadily against his back. But as I held the crisp photocopies of his handwritten surveillance logs in my hands, the truth finally broke completely through the heavy, blinding grief. He had never abandoned me to the wolves. He was actively hunting them. He had spent his final months painstakingly laying down a hidden track, gathering the exact high-caliber ammunition he knew I would desperately need when the war inevitably reached my doorstep. He tried to leave me a perfectly clear path back to the absolute truth. The only tragedy was that death arrived just a few weeks before he could spring the steel trap himself. He did not leave me a broken, defenseless legacy. He left me a fully loaded weapon, and now I knew exactly where to aim it. The walls began closing in exactly 72 hours before the gavel was scheduled to strike. The psychological strain was overwhelming, crafted to slowly strip the breath from my lungs until I yearned for a quiet escape. Celeste never came to me in person. She dispatched her planner in her place. Nolan Pike arrived at my apartment building unannounced, bypassing the front desk security with the smooth arrogance of a man who owned the entire city. He stood in my doorway, holding a pristine leather briefcase. He offered a deeply practiced look of sympathetic fatigue. "Willow, we can end this ugly war tonight," Pike said softly. "Celeste is prepared to offer a highly generous, completely private settlement. You formally withdraw your opposition to the corporate sale. In exchange, you maintain a guaranteed monthly stipend for the rest of your natural life. No public humiliation, no messy courtroom battles. You simply agree to enter a voluntary residential treatment program for a few months. We keep the entire ordeal strictly confidential to protect your father's honorable legacy." I looked at his expensive shoes, then at his perfectly straight tie. He was offering me a golden cage built entirely on the premise that I was broken. I closed the heavy door directly in his face without speaking a single syllable. Less than 6 hours later, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was Reed Harrow. My stepbrother looked entirely hollowed out. He stood in my hallway with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, radiating a toxic mixture of genuine guilt and bitter resentment. He did not ask to come inside. "Maybe my mother is actually right about you," Reed muttered, staring past my shoulder into the dark apartment. "Maybe you have finally pushed yourself completely over the edge. You are so violently obsessed with winning, with beating every single system, that you cannot even see the damage you are causing. Just let the company go, Willow. Stop digging for ghosts that do not exist. He turned and walked away before I could respond. His performance felt entirely too rehearsed, driven by an undercurrent of desperate panic rather than brotherly concern. I locked the door and immediately booted up my secondary forensic rig. I ran a comprehensive financial sweep on Reed's public records. The truth surfaced within 45 minutes. Reed was drowning in a catastrophic ocean of debt. Exactly 2 years ago, he had launched a highly ambitious, poorly managed technology startup. It collapsed spectacularly, leaving him personally liable for over $400,000 in unsecured vendor loans. I tracked the routing numbers on his recent bank deposits. Celeste had been quietly bailing him out, feeding him massive, untraceable cash injections from her private foundation accounts just to keep his creditors at bay. Reed was not a concerned sibling. He was a terrified hostage. His loyalty had been completely purchased by his own financial terror. If Celeste lost her corporate buyout, Reed would be destroyed. The psychological warfare escalated the following morning. Dr. Simon Rafe officially submitted his finalized psychological evaluation to the county docket. I secured a digital copy. It was the most lethal piece of paper I had ever read. Rafe did not describe me as a raving, incoherent lunatic. He painted me as the absolute most dangerous type of patient a court could ever encounter. He wrote that I remained highly logical and professionally functional, which made my condition terrifyingly deceptive. He officially classified me as suffering from an intricate, systemized persecutory delusion. According to his deeply flawed professional opinion, my forensic expertise allowed me to effortlessly interpret absolutely any random piece of data as a direct, malicious conspiracy against me. If I presented a logical argument, it was just my high-functioning disease talking. He created a perfect, inescapable paradox where the harder I fought to prove my sanity with hard evidence, the crazier I looked to the outside world. Leveraging this devastating medical report, Nolan Pike filed an emergency motion to expedite the proceedings. He argued that every single day of delay caused irreversible financial damage to Blackwell Archive Logistics. The judge agreed. The court abruptly moved the hearing up by 2 full weeks. I was instantly stripped of my most valuable asset: time. I had virtually no runway left to sway public opinion or untangle the massive web of corporate lies. The sudden compression of the timeline nearly broke my only structural support. Lena Dorsey called me on a heavily encrypted line at 2 a.m. Her voice, usually sharp and fearless, was trembling violently.
They hit my firm with a massive wave of subpoenas. Willow, Lena said, her breath catching in her throat.
Pike is demanding every single file, every client log, every piece of internal correspondence I have touched for the last 5 years. He is threatening to drag Meridian Chain Forensics directly into the center of a federal corporate espionage investigation. If I walk into that courtroom and testify for you, he will burn my entire private career straight to the ground. She was standing right on the precipice of backing out, if Lena walked away. My chain of custody for the copied server data would completely disintegrate. I would be left standing at the defense table holding unverified computer logs that Dr. Rafe would immediately dismiss as my own manic fabrications. I only need you to hold the line for 24 more hours, Lena, I told her, keeping my voice utterly devoid of panic. Just verify the extraction protocols on the record. I will handle the rest. I promise you, by tomorrow afternoon, Nolan Pike will be fighting for his own law license. She hesitated for a long, agonizing 10 seconds before finally exhaling sharply and agreeing to appear. Then, As the crushing pressure reached its absolute peak, a tiny, seemingly insignificant administrative notification arrived in my encrypted inbox. It was a standard procedural email from the chief clerk of the Halston County Court. Because Nolan Pike had aggressively contested the fundamental integrity of all my gathered evidence, the presiding judge had issued a strict evidentiary mandate. The email stated that the judge would explicitly prioritize raw, native files, original system access logs, and unedited forensic recovery artifacts. The court would afford absolutely no legal weight to polished summary presentations, synthesized charts, or secondary forensic interpretations. I read the clerk's email 3 separate times. The crushing weight on my chest suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp clarity. I finally understood the fatal structural flaw in Celeste's master plan. She had built her entire legal assault on heavily manufactured optics. Her case relied exclusively on glossy, high-resolution photographs, beautifully formatted legal summaries, smoothly curated audio clips, and eloquent, theoretical psychological profiles. She was a storyteller who manipulated feelings. I was a digital forensic analyst who possessed absolutely zero talent for telling soft, compelling stories. But I held the exact, raw, ugly, unformatted machine data the judge was now legally mandated to look at. The night before the hearing, my apartment was completely silent. I did not stand in front of my bathroom mirror rehearsing a passionate, tearful speech. I did not practice making eye contact to project innocence. A speech was exactly what they expected. A desperate plea for justice would only feed directly into Dr. Rafe's clinical diagnosis of paranoia. Instead, I sat at my dual monitors and carefully sequenced the digital traps. I arranged the raw data packets, the unedited server access logs, and the microscopic printer steganography codes into a precise, unyielding chronological order. I was not preparing a defense. I was building a strict logical corridor with no exit doors. I engineered the sequence so that Celeste, Brent, Reed, and Pike would all be forced to confidently confirm their own elegant lies under oath. I would let them lock themselves tightly into perjury before they ever realized the steel jaws of the trap were already snapping shut around their ankles. I powered down the monitors at dawn, perfectly ready to walk into the fire. The courtroom was suffocatingly hot, the air thick with the smell of polished mahogany and impending execution. Nolan Pike stood before Judge Adrian Mercer, projecting the absolute authority of a man delivering a tragic but deeply necessary truth. He did not attack my character directly. He performed a flawless, surgical strike on my entire profession. Your Honor, what makes this case so profoundly heartbreaking is that the very skills that once made Willow Blackwell a brilliant forensic analyst are exactly what fuel her current pathology, Pike declared, his voice resonating through the grand chamber. Her meticulous note-taking has completely devolved into a frantic, consuming obsession. Her dedication to her intense work schedule has warped into a debilitating insomnia that has shattered her cognitive stability. When she claims unseen people are secretly altering company documents, this is no longer a professional assessment. It is a highly systematized paranoid delusion. He painted me as a broken machine, rapidly misfiring and destroying everything around it. The gallery listened with rapt attention, nodding solemnly at every twisted point he made. Celeste took the stand next. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, looking completely exhausted and fragile. When Pike gently asked her about our relationship following my father's sudden death, she let a single, perfect tear roll slowly down her pale cheek. I only wanted to save my husband's legacy, Celeste whispered. her voice cracking precisely at the right moment. I tried to comfort her. I tried to wrap my arms around her so many times in those dark hallways, but she just shoved me away. She looked at me with such absolute terror, claiming I was part of some massive shadow conspiracy. I am just a heartbroken widow trying to keep our family from completely disintegrating under the weight of her illness. She did not look like a ruthless corporate usurper. She looked exactly like a battered, noble saint. Dr. Simon Rafe followed her, bringing the heavy, undeniable artillery of medical jargon. He sat comfortably in the witness chair, adjusting his silk tie, and read directly from his expensive diagnostic report. His voice was incredibly smooth, hypnotic in its absolute academic certainty. He spoke of severe cognitive dissonance, auditory hallucinations driven by extreme grief, and localized paranoid ideation, because the people in the gallery and the judge rarely understood the deeply flawed, remote methodology behind such private evaluations. They were entirely mesmerized by the sheer academic weight of his words. He effectively locked me inside a clinical cage constructed entirely of multisyllable psychiatric terms. Then came Brent Sloan. The chief financial officer straightened his suit jacket and spoke strictly about the brutal corporate reality. The Rookhaven Capital merger is our absolute only viable exit strategy, Brent stated firmly, looking directly at the judge with a heavy, burdened expression. If we do not finalize this sale within the next 2 weeks, we will be forced to aggressively liquidate our physical assets. Hundreds of our most loyal employees will lose their jobs right before the holidays. Willow is actively destroying the very thing her father spent his entire life building. Purely because she is trapped inside a paranoid delusion she refuses to let go of. Reed Harrow was the final piece of their flawless, devastating puzzle. My stepbrother walked to the stand looking pale, staring down at his expensive shoes. When Pike asked him to describe my recent behavior, Reed played the reluctant, devastated betrayer perfectly. She told me people were editing documents in the dark, Reed said, his voice trembling slightly. She said people were stealing her voice and planting it in different places to ruin her. I tried to tell her she just needed sleep, but she started screaming that the network systems were lying to everyone. It did not sound like a professional warning. It sounded like she was completely losing her mind. By the time Pike rested his case, the air in the room felt impossibly heavy. The entire court was leaning so far toward the plaintiff's table that the final verdict felt like a mere administrative formality. The execution was happening right in broad daylight, and everyone was watching in silent, sympathetic agreement. Judge Mercer peered over his heavy gold glasses, his expression grim and impatient. Miss Blackwell, it is your turn. Do you have any statements or witnesses to present in your defense? I stood up slowly from the defense table. I walked to the center of the wooden floor, holding nothing but a single yellow legal pad. I did not look frantic. I did not look angry. I did not shed a single tear. I looked directly at Nolan Pike. I do not deny the insomnia, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the heavy courtroom silence. I do not deny that I sit in this very room counting the metal air conditioning vents on the ceiling just to keep my heart rate down. I do not deny saying strange, disjointed things in the chaotic days following my father's funeral. I am deeply exhausted, and I am profoundly grieving. A soft murmur rippled through the packed gallery. Pike leaned back in his leather chair, a slight, victorious smirk touching the corners of his mouth. He thought I was finally surrendering. He thought I was actively digging my own grave right there on the official, unerasable court record. But I was not surrendering. I was simply clearing the board of all their emotional leverage by admitting to the human flaws. I stripped away their ability to use my grief as a weapon. I turned my absolute attention to the witness box. I did not deliver a grand, sweeping monologue. I executed a rapid, relentless series of incredibly brief questions, forcing each of them back to the stand for a highly focused cross-examination. I did not argue with their emotional narratives. I only demanded absolute technical precision. "Dr. Rafe," I asked, staring blankly at the psychiatrist as he retook the oath, "can you state for the official record the exact internet protocol address used to access my private medical portal to retrieve those specific audio files you analyzed?" Rafe blinked, visibly thrown off balance by the hyper-specific, clinical question. The audio files were provided securely by the plaintiff's legal team. I believe the source address was officially documented as an internal medical server belonging to the clinic. "Thank you," I said flatly. I turned to Brent.
Mr.
"Sloan, please confirm the exact manufacturer and serial number of the color printer used to generate the original physical copy of my father's final directive regarding the company sale." Brent frowned, exchanging a quick, confused glance with Pike across the room. "It was the standard corporate laser printer located on the primary executive floor. I certainly do not memorize hardware serial numbers." "Noted," I replied, my tone completely devoid of emotion. I pivoted sharply to Celeste. "Mrs. Blackwell, please confirm for the court record the precise date and time you claim my father independently created the hidden appendix for the Rook Haven Capital sale." "It was the second Tuesday of last month, at approximately 9 in the morning," Celeste answered softly, maintaining her fragile, wounded posture. She relaxed her shoulders slightly. She clearly believed I was merely lost in a pathetic, obsessive maze of irrelevant details. She thought I was proving Dr. Rafe's clinical diagnosis right in front of the judge's eyes. I went straight down the line. I asked Reed for the exact digital timestamp of our hallway conversation. I asked Pike to confirm the exact network file directory where the high-resolution photographs of my apartment were originally stored before being submitted to the court. I forced every single one of them to repeat their fabricated technical details out loud, under the strict penalty of perjury, locking their answers permanently into the official court transcript. I did not leave them a single inch of breathing room to alter their stories later when the wind suddenly changed direction. They all answered confidently, completely unaware that I was systematically sealing every possible exit door in the room. Judge Mercer checked his heavy gold pocket watch and sighed loudly. "Miss Blackwell, this court has indulged your highly specific questions, but we are rapidly approaching the afternoon recess. Do you have a substantive point to make regarding your mental capacity? Or are we simply going to continue verifying administrative trivia?" I stopped pacing. I stood completely still and looked at the large digital projector screen mounted directly behind the witness stand. It was currently displaying a beautifully designed, highly polished summary graphic created by Nolan Pike's expensive legal team, detailing my supposed mental decline with colorful charts and curated text boxes. "I have only one final request before we recess for the afternoon, Your Honor," I said, my voice entirely steady and cold. "I respectfully ask the court to turn off the plaintiff's visual presentation software immediately. I request that we connect my encrypted forensic drive to the court's projector and open the native files, the original system access logs, and the raw forensic recovery artifacts directly on that screen, exactly as your strict evidentiary mandate requires." Pike immediately shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the wood floor. But the heavy steel trap had already snapped entirely shut. The projector screen flickered, shifting from Nolan Pike's beautifully curated pastel graphics to the harsh, high-contrast black and green of my native command terminal. The courtroom held its breath. First, I pulled up the audio file Dr. Rafe had used to diagnose my supposed break from reality. I played the choppy, frantic recording of my voice. Then, I opened the server extraction log alongside it. I highlighted the source Internet Protocol address that had downloaded the raw session files from the clinic's encrypted cloud. "This address does not belong to my apartment," I stated firmly, pointing at the glowing numbers. "It does not belong to Dr. Rafe. This specific network routing address is registered exclusively to the downtown headquarters of Celeste Blackwell's private philanthropic foundation." The file was stolen directly from her desk. Pike opened his mouth to object, but I was already typing the next command. I brought up the emergency directive my father had supposedly signed, the one urging the immediate sale of the company. I split the screen, displaying the unalterable disaster recovery log from our cloud service provider. "This log proves the exact moment the file was generated," I continued, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "This document was not drafted before my father suffered his aneurysm. The system proves it was created exactly 17 days after he died. It was manually backdated. I did not give them a single second to recover." I immediately magnified the margins of the physical document Celeste had submitted into evidence as the absolute original. I applied the blue light spectrum filter, revealing the microscopic yellow tracking dots scattered across the white paper. "These printer steganography codes identify the exact machine that printed this page," I explained. "It was not printed at the corporate headquarters. The serial number matches the exact color laser printer sitting inside the private lake house owned by our chief financial officer, Brent Sloan." Brent physically flinched in his heavy wooden chair. The polished veneer of the corporate savior was rapidly peeling away. I pivoted to the financial motive. I projected the hidden appendix of the Rookhaven Capital buyout, the pages purposefully omitted from the board's presentation. I highlighted the massive consulting fee. "Upon closing, $8,500,000 is scheduled to be wired to Marigold Advisory," I read aloud. I brought up the state tax registry. "The registered agent of Marigold is Arthur Sterling, Celeste's biological brother. The co-signer is Brent Sloan's personal wealth accountant." This entire petition for my mental incapacity was never about saving the company or protecting employees. It was a calculated legal maneuver to paralyze my voting rights just long enough to steal millions of dollars. I turned my gaze to Reed Harrow. He was already pale, sweating visibly under the fluorescent lights. I projected a sequence of his private text messages and the corresponding untraceable cash deposits from his mother's charity fund. "Reed," I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper, "did you genuinely hear me screaming at the walls? Or did you simply memorize a script to pay off a $400,000 business debt?" Reed broke completely. The immense pressure he had been carrying for weeks shattered right there on the witness stand. He gripped the wooden railing, his voice cracking violently. "She gave me the words," Reed choked out, refusing to look at his mother. "She told me exactly what phrases to use. She said I had to tell people you were obsessed with edited data. She said judges always believe a concerned family member over complicated technical files. I just needed the money to stop the creditors." The entire courtroom fell dead silent. The heavy silence was broken only by the sound of Judge Adrian Mercer slowly taking off his gold-rimmed glasses. He leaned far over his massive wooden bench, squinting closely at the raw digital timelines glowing on the projector screen. He read the numbers, the matched IP addresses, the unarguable machine logs. He let out a long, heavy breath and shifted his cold gaze directly toward the plaintiff's table. "Mrs. Blackwell," Judge Mercer said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, icy register. "Do you still wish to argue that your stepdaughter is suffering from a severe paranoid delusion? Or is it simply the case that she is vastly more accurate than every single other person standing in this room?" Celeste panicked. The flawless mask of the grieving, benevolent widow finally slipped, revealing the terrified desperation underneath. She jumped to her feet, her hands shaking wildly. "Your Honor, you have to understand," she pleaded, pointing a trembling finger at Brent. "I was only trying to protect the future of the company. Brent told me the business was completely failing. He said we had to push the sale through, or we would lose everything." It was the ultimate betrayal among thieves. Brent jumped up immediately, his face flushed with sudden, violent rage. He was not going to take the fall alone. "Do not put this entirely on me," Brent shouted, completely abandoning his polished corporate demeanor. "You wanted the payout just as much as I did. You were the one who hired the psychiatrist. You were the one who snuck into the hospital room. We planned this together at the lake house for over a year." In his absolute panic to deflect the blame, he accidentally confessed to the long-standing secret affair and their direct, coordinated effort to manufacture the fake psychiatric profile. He handed the court the exact motive and the detailed execution of the conspiracy in one breathless, furious sentence. Judge Mercer slammed his heavy wooden gavel down with the force of a thunderclap. "That is quite enough," the judge roared. "The petition to declare Willow Blackwell mentally incapacitated is dismissed with extreme prejudice. The temporary suspension of her executive voting rights is immediately lifted. Furthermore, I am officially freezing any and all proceedings regarding the corporate sale to Rookhaven Capital." Judge Mercer pointed his gavel directly at Nolan Pike, who was now staring blankly at his ruined legal career. "I am referring this entire case file to the district attorney." The judge continued. "There will be a full, immediate investigation into evidence tampering, illegal access of protected medical records, coordinated perjury, and severe corporate fraud. Court is adjourned." When the heavy wooden doors finally swung open, the media and the extended relatives were in absolute chaos. I did not stay to watch the fallout. I did not scream in victory or break down in relieved tears. I calmly packed up my server drive, walked out of the courthouse, and immediately went back to work. I retook absolute control of Blackwell Archive logistics the very next morning. The first administrative action I took was reinstating the massive, independent forensic audit my father had originally scheduled before he died. I legally purchased Reed's crippling business debt, forcing him to sign a binding agreement to fully cooperate as a star witness for the federal investigators in exchange for his financial freedom. I did not return to the sprawling family mansion. Instead, I drove out to the industrial fringes of Ash Creek. I unlocked the heavy rolling doors of the abandoned storage facility where I had found my father's hidden surveillance logs. Over the next 6 months, I completely gutted the massive warehouse. I brought in specialized contractors and transformed the empty concrete shell into an advanced pro bono digital forensics center. I dedicated the facility entirely to providing free data recovery and system audits for individuals who had been targeted by vicious civil fraud and coordinated corporate theft. My stepmother and her accomplices had tried to completely silence me by turning my greatest strengths into a humiliating weapon against my sanity. They built a brilliant, terrifying illusion. But an illusion only survives in the dark. I learned that the perfect revenge is never about making the loudest noise in the room. It is simply about holding the absolute, undeniable truth and waiting for the exact right moment to turn on the lights. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please drop a comment below letting me know where you are tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel. Like this video and support me further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by even more people.